This is the view looking due west across the airfield. On the far horizon there's a tower block, and that tower block is in central Woking. Furthest horizon is probably 20 miles away. In the foreground there is this strange looking circular structure, and that is the Ockham VOR. It's a navigation beacon. Every aircraft taking off or landing at Heathrow uses that beacon, and there are civil aviation regulations that prevent any buildings going up in the vicinity of that beacon which might interfere with its signal. Over here, that is Bridgend Farm and Old Farm. That land is not owned by the Caymans company that owns this agricultural land that it refers to as an airfield. But nonetheless, Guildford Borough Council has seen fit to include that plot of land inside the site for a new town. Now, survey the scene. Would you think that this was an airfield? Doesn't look like an airfield. Would you think that this didn't meet any of the 5 legal purposes of the green belt? Quite hard to believe, isn't it? Now, of course, it's quite different from the air, because from the air you can see the runway, but nobody has used the runway for over 40 years. And there are no structures on this land except the one you can see. And it was sold back to the original owner, Lord Lytton, in 1980, who inherited the Ockham Park estate as agricultural land. And the only reason the runway is still there is because Her Majesty's government tried to save some money and reneged on the wartime commitment it made to restore the land to the condition it was in when it was first commandeered in 1942. This view, you might think, was worth preserving. You'd be wrong. Wisley Property Investments, Cayman Islands company that owns this field, has other plans. It proposes to put a road where I'm standing, and everything you see in front of you will be blotted out. There will be houses as far as the eye can see for a mile in front of us, all the way to the A3. You can't see the A3 because it's lower down. This is a sandy plateau between Ockham Common, which is over there, and the village of Ockham, which is just below that tree line there. And they want to cover it with over 2,000 houses at an extraordinary density. 2,000 houses is about 30% more than all of the houses in East Horsley. And there's only about 50 hectares, maybe 60, that they're allowed to build on in this field. And so they're proposing to put 30% more houses on this site than in the whole of East Horsley, and it is a fraction of the area. So the density will be, I'd guess, between 5 and 10 times greater than in East Horsley. This hill in front of us, with the hay taken off it, the bales wrapped up in green, is called Hatchford Hill, and it's a watershed, as is the land I'm standing on. Everything on the top of that hill drains into the river Mole, which passes Cobham, and the River Mole is less than a mile on the other side of that hill. I guess probably. If we swivel round very slowly, that's Ockham Common behind those trees, and now we're looking almost due west, and those concrete blocks on the horizon are in working, and we're looking across the Wey Valley. The River Wey flows from left to right between us and those concrete blocks which are in central Woking, and so this whole area is a natural watershed between two of the main rivers that drain central Sussex and the Weald and southern Surrey. Now we're looking in that direction due south, and the hill you can see on the horizon is the North Downs, and the highest bit of it I think is Wicks Hill, which is just above West Horsley, and from Wicks Hill, which is an area of outstanding natural beauty, you actually have quite a good view of this site. I'll do you 365 degrees. Take it in. I don't know whether the microphone picks up the skylark above. Have a good look. That's Hatchford Hill there with the green bales of hay on it. Coming round, it's a development that used to be, it's called 5 acres, it used to be a farm. We're looking across the runway now, we're looking pretty much north. Behind those trees is Ockham and Hatchford Common, which is an area protected by law as a special protection area. We come all the way around. Here we are. We're parallel with the runway, looking due west towards Woking. You can see the skyscrapers in Woking. Here we are, that's Bridgend Farm. Nearly 365 degrees now. And here are the North Downs. Probably at that end of it is Guildford. Coming round here, all the Saxon villages, settlements built where the chalk meets the clay below the line of the North Downs, and that's Wicks Hill again. I'd like to ask you a question. Does this look like the largest brownfield site in Surrey? Is it really derelict? The crop doesn't look in bad condition, does it? Planted every year, rotated. They call this bad agricultural land. Interesting. I'd be interested to know what really bad agricultural land looks like. And by the way, consider the word derelict. It conjures up a nasty image, doesn't it? It's in fact completely irrelevant to the purposes of the Green Belt. That's what the judges in the courts have held. If the land satisfies the purpose of the Green Belt, it doesn't matter actually whether it's derelict or not. Now you might say that it was a deceit to call it derelict, but under English law you can't libel or slander an inanimate object like a piece of land. And there we are. So there we are, we're looking down what was once a grass airstrip commandeered in the war to allow Vickers to fly out the aeroplanes it was making in nearby Brooklands towards Weybridge, and that's really all it was ever used for. After the war, when jet engines came in, the jet engines set fire to the grass runway, and so they put down concrete, and then they never took the concrete up again, despite having an obligation to do so. But then they were the government, you see, and it's been commandeered in a national emergency, and who are we to argue with the government? There you are. Oh, and by the way, the last shots, the first shots I showed you, were taken from over there. See the four tall poplar trees, the shorter poplar tree, and then there's a Scots pine there. It was taken from in front of that Scots pine. And this, of course, is the VOR here, around which it's illegal to build anything. And is this view worth preserving? You too could come and stand here and admire this view, because I'm standing on a public footpath. It doesn't look like a public footpath, but this line through the crop is in fact a public right-of-way. And if I do 180 degrees, you can see over there it leads down to Ockham Common. And our medieval ancestors walked up and down here from their houses to Ockham Common. There's a skylark. Not many places you can see a skylark within 20 miles of London. Ground nesting bird. Almost certainly won't be here if they build 2,000 houses and put 5,000 people here with their cats and dogs to destroy their nests on the ground. Oh, and by the way, you can just about see the line of the runway there. Everything to the north of the runway is within 400 metres of the special protection zone. So you're not allowed to build on that bit. You'd think that would stop anybody trying to do anything with that piece of land. It is in fact earmarked as a site of nature conservation interest. But our developer, ever resourceful, wishes to turn it into a site of alternative natural green space for the 5,000 people who might live here to use with their cats and their dogs. No consideration at all given, of course, the fact that cats and the dogs and the rare species in one of the last remaining parts of Surrey Heath that exist might not be compatible. But hell, you know, what about a few birds? It's only the last 5% of Surrey heathland, why don't we get rid of all of it? And hell, a few ground nesting birds, let them go the way of the dodo. Let them be extinct. Why let it get in the way of making a few quick bucks? Here we are, we're looking south again. This is the end of that footpath that I'm standing on, or one end of it. We're looking south. Behind those trees is Wicks Hill. Over here, between us and Wicks Hill, down in the valley there, is East Horsley, and then West Horsley. And over there is Ockham. And if the trees were off the tree, you'd be able to see the Hoboy pub in the middle of Ockham. Worth commenting on the private property note, the boundary of the Cayman Islands company's land is this fence. And since they don't have enough land to make a quote-unquote sustainable new town here, Guildford Borough Council, in its wisdom, has seen fit to draw a line round the meadow that we're looking at, which doesn't belong to the Cayman's property developer, and to rezone it. So all that will be built on if they get their way. Now that does look a little bit more derelict, and the reason is that it's grazed cattle earlier and it hasn't been topped yet. I wonder how you'd feel if you lived in a building that suddenly had a line drawn around it that said it was in the middle of a building site. From one point of view, you might be delighted. the value of your property obviously goes up. I'd guess at least 10 times, probably more. You might be able to retire to a tax haven, never work again. But then you'd be desecrating this land that's been farmed certainly for 500 years, probably for nearer 1,000, and that would be your legacy. That's what I had left behind, a housing estate on my nice green field. I wonder how posterity will judge that. And I wonder how posterity will judge Guildford Borough Council for putting temptation in the way of these landowners, several of whom have had the principle and the guts to write to Guildford Borough Council and tell them that they don't want to sell. Now, that should make the land, quote unquote, unavailable, and therefore ineligible to be included in the draft local plan. But why let a few facts get in the way of what we want to do? Let's ignore a few policies. No, they're your own policies. Oh, never mind, we'll ignore them, we'll just put them in there, we'll let the public knock it down. You know, the public's got nothing better to do than to come on a Saturday afternoon and take photographs, try and prove the obvious. The public, unfortunately, is not paid to do this, as the civil servants in Guildford Borough Council are supposed to do a proper job, to get it right. Yeah. Developers, it's very big of the developer, they say they're going to preserve this view. They're going to create an open space here between probably 800 houses in that way and probably, who knows, 1,200 houses that way. Very generous of them, I'd say. Here it is again, the Downs looking south from Three Farms Meadow, a place that they think is an airfield, but hasn't been an airfield for over 40 years. That's Wicks Hill, area of outstanding natural beauty. And funnily enough, this is not a view the developer thinks is worth preserving. They want to put houses here as well, because if they don't put houses here, it won't be sustainable. Because to be sustainable, you have to make it big. And since they don't have enough land to put them all on their own land, they have to enclose other people's land inside their new zone for a new town, all in the cause of progress. Aren't they beautiful? Don't you just love these animals? And the calves? And the North Downs in the background. I have to remind you, of course, that this land doesn't serve any of the purposes of the green belt. No, I'm not saying that. Savills say that. Savills have written a representation on behalf of the Cayman Islands owner. That representation can be found on their website, so you can read it for yourselves. And in that representation they have an astonishing statement. They say that this land doesn't fulfill any of the 4 purposes of the green belt, which they quote. They forget about the 5th purpose, of course. They think that's irrelevant. The 5th purpose of the green belt, which they didn't mention, is that it helps regenerate brownfield land. How is that relevant? Well, because if it was very easy just to come and build a house here, you'd make a lot more money building it here, because you don't have to clean the land. You don't have to knock down any pre-existing buildings. You can just plonk a new house here. And so the fifth purpose of the green belt, to assist in regenerating brownfield land, is in fact supported by this land being green belt, because if they can't build here, they have to think about redeveloping something that's already been built on near a town. Now, it's very unfair to look at this view. There must be a housing estate on the other side. That way is due east, and that's Hatchford Hill there, with the River Mole on the other side. And they want to run a green lane up that hill. A green what, you ask? I asked the same question. Green lane is a public footpath that you can turn into a right-of-way for any vehicle almost. Four-wheel drives, motorcycles, anything you want. And the footpath there doesn't even lead anywhere. So this is the view looking north. And just behind those trees is the heathland of Ockham Common, and beyond that is the M25. And beyond that is a bit more heathland, and then beyond that is the Mole Valley, and then you get to Byfleet, which would be that way, and you get to Cobham, which would be that way. Looks derelict, doesn't it? I just have to show you this magnificent herd. Look at that handsome bull and the beautiful cows all around. Have any children? Bring them here. This is a public footpath I'm standing on. This is real agriculture. Quite difficult to make farming work, particularly since small plots of land are not economic to farm, and if they're landlocked by towns and they get smaller and smaller, then they don't become worth farming at all. Here we are. I'm glad that the bull is more interested in her than me, and that I'm not wearing anything too red. Here we are, we're on another public footpath, which runs almost north-south across this land. We're looking almost due west towards Woking, and if we do the 180, looking northish down the footpath, along the land, towards that hill in the background, which is Hatchford Hill. The hamlet of Hatchford, according to Elmbridge, doesn't really exist anymore. They've put up a sign at Hatchford saying Cobham. I'm sure it's administratively more convenient to call it Cobham, even though it's been Hatchford for hundreds of years. Oh, and by the way, those poplar trees at the end, those poplar trees form a defensible barrier for the new proposed green belt boundary. Sounds plausible, doesn't it? Except of course that those poplar trees are in someone's garden, and except of course that trees are vegetation, and they don't last forever, and they sometimes die. And if the people who want to develop this had a sense of history, they would know that this area was once covered in elm trees. If you'd come here 50 years ago, you'd have seen elm trees there instead of poplar trees. Hundreds of them. And They all got Dutch elm disease in the 1970s, and they've all been pulled down. That's what you call a defensible greenbelt boundary. And of course some of those trees are horse chestnuts. Horse chestnuts get a disease called bleeding canker. Some of the trees over there have had bleeding canker and have been taken down. And the second biggest tree you can see there that isn't a poplar tree is an ash tree. And you have to have been living in a different place for a long time not to have heard of ash dieback. Pity poor Bridge End Farm, about to be caught like the baby goat in the coils of the developer's python. Here we are, looking west again. Just in the distance there is that tower block in Central Woking. And here's the runway. Let's take a look. Well, here's the runway. This is what justifies calling it the largest brownfield site in Surrey. Except, of course, it's not true. Developers are not governed by BBC rules that say you have to give both sides of the story, or that you have to get your facts right. But what proportion of the land do you guess it constitutes? In fact, on the developer's own numbers, it constitutes only 1/4, 25% of all the land. And of course they include in that every square inch of the runway. And they're arguing that the runway constitutes previously developed land. Now, it's actually an interesting legal point as to whether a runway in fact meets the strict legal definition of previously developed land. Because the definition requires there to have been structures. Quite obviously, a runway can't have any structures on it, and never could and never did have any structures on it. And so if you exclude the runway, the only bit of this land parcel that's previously developed is the concrete around the former hangars that were all removed. And that comprises only about 10 or 15% of the whole thing. So for the sake of 10 or 15%, we change the designation of this land from agricultural land, greenbelt land, to derelict brownfield land. And by the way, all of that land that they're including, because they have to include it, that's never been developed. That's always been farmland. As long as history relates, probably. Not just as long as Guildford Borough Council can remember. This is the public footpath looking north towards Auchencollen. This field here, the runway just there. Pretty big field. I guess 50 to 100 acres from one end to the other. It's going to be turned into a site of alternative natural green space, but it's not exactly out of bounds for the wildlife, is it? It's been earmarked as a site of nature conservation interest. In fact, beyond that crash barrier up there, which actually protects another public right-of-way, there is a site of nature conservation interest, which Guildford Borough Council was gracious enough to designate some time ago. So this is going to be the site of alternative green space, the Sang. Why does it have to be alternative? Why can't they just accept it the way it is? Well, it has to be alternative because this runway is going to be pulled up. Every brick of it, probably. It's the south side of the runway. They're going to build their 2,000 houses. And And on the north side they're going to have a park. And the park, of course, is not for the wildlife, which is what the 400-metre exclusion zone is supposed to protect. It's going to be for all the new residents. And we mustn't be beastly to them, because they need housing. But of course, most of them are going to be desirable residences well out of the affordability range of the people for whom the council executive spends a lot of time arguing. Might just have a little aside on that point. Of course we need social housing. Of course we need social rent. How to do it? Is it really sensible to buy 4 houses to get 1 free? Yeah, that's the 20% rule. Or to buy 5 houses to get 2 free, which is the 40% rule. I think that's how the arithmetic works. So you buy a whole lot more houses, I mean buy in inverted commas. Guildford Borough Council gives planning permission for 5 houses in order to achieve an end result of 2 social houses. But why does it have to be here? You know, they say it's in the public interest. It really wasn't in the public interest to decide to have a new town without any public inquiry or any public competition. Of course it was in the developer's interest. I wonder what the relationship is between the developer and Guildford Borough Council, that the developer manages to get its site included in the draft local plan as the only site in the whole of Guildford Borough Council. But of course, if you're going to give them a new town to fulfil their housing numbers, which they haven't even decided what the final housing requirement is, but you know, they roll out the red carpet and they give you pride of place in the new draft local plan. And they ignore the fact that no exceptional circumstances for the green belt have been shown. They ignore the fact that the site is too small, and they ignore the fact that it's not even available because the private landowners actually prefer to look at this than 2,000 houses. 2,000 houses doesn't sound a lot, does it? But you're looking at the whole of East Horsley over there. That would be the whole of East Horsley from there all the way to there. Densely packed, probably 5 to 10 times more densely packed than in East Horsley. That's reality. That's not the sugar-coated, Christmas-wrapped, saccharine version that the consultants who are in the pay of Guildford Borough Council and in the pay of developers come up with. What's that, I hear you say? A sign of dereliction? Maybe the developer's right. Look at the derelict runway here. In fact, that's happened very recently. It's happened in the last few months. That's the developer digging a hole to test the geology, lithography of the soil here. And a 3-metre hole was dug there to see what was underneath, so that they can work out what sort of foundations they'll need for their thousands of houses. 3-metre holes, by the way, all fill up with water, except they don't leave them open long enough because they're a health and safety hazard. So the water table is quite high despite being on the top of a hill.